All right, so we are back. I can't decide where to point TikTok. For anyone on Twitch watching this later, this is TikTok, and TikTok's eyes could go in a couple directions, but it's only a phone, so it only really has so much range, you know? But as anyone who's kept an eye on the schedule knows, today is Thursday, and that means we read. So, picking up again, as I said just a moment ago, ending the Stardew Valley stream, we're picking up with this book right here. So it says right here. I actually made it large enough so I think it'll actually be useful. Susan Sontag called the description of this part of the book, which is like in the Kindle version that I have, combined illness as metaphor and AIDS in its metaphors, which she wrote 10 years afterward, because of course that's when she could have had a better insight rather than the late 70s. So, I imagine, even though I didn't see the exact year, I imagine it was probably published like in the late 80s. But just to give a little background, um, well, actually, if you want a super extensive discussion or understanding, definitely check back at the other readings that I have from the Twitch, which might still be there. If anything, the Twitch readings are still on the YouTube. I think I might have to make them public though, so I'll do that after this. But a short little descriptor of this part of the book was goes like this. Considers the metaphors with which acquired immune deficiency syndrome is cloaked, the presentation of the illness as a plague, and its bearing on the way society views disease, sexuality, and catastrophe. But as like a little tiny reminder from the first part of the book, illness is metaphor. She mostly went over like tuberculosis and cancer. And I think that it was just an important book for folks to have to listen to at their leisure just because of everything going on in the world. And the way that the language that we use to describe something is as important as and informs the way that oftentimes we respond, especially to like ongoing crises. So I'd heard so many people say incredible things about it, and I've only been shown that those things are true and more from having done the reading on here. And I hope folks have enjoyed it. But we're picking up where we left off last, which is the section 4 in this particular one. I think I'm actually going to turn TikTok over here just so that you can see where we're actually at. But if anyone wants to see the write-up that I just read, it's like a sentence long, take a peek over on the Twitch, of course. But if not, we're just going to continue. So, it goes like this. Etymologically, patient means sufferer. It is not suffering as such that is most deeply feared, but suffering that degrades. That illness can be not only an epoch of suffering, but the occasion of some kind of self-transcendence is affirmed by sentimental literature, and more convincingly by case histories offered by doctor writers. Some illnesses seem more apt than others for this kind of meditation. Oliver Sacks uses catastrophic she broke up the word, so I swear my brain can never make sense of certain words when that happens. Neurological illness as the material for his portraits of suffering and self-transcendence, diminishment, and exaltation. His great forerunner, Sir Thomas Browne, used tuberculosis for a similar purpose, to ruminate about illness in general, in a letter to a friend upon occasion of the death of his intimate friend, 1657, making pre-romantic sense out of some of the familiar stereotypes about tuberculosis, that it is a distinctive manner of being ill, this being a lingering disease, capital D, and a distinctive manner of dying, his soft death. A fiction about soft or easy deaths, in fact, dying of tuberculosis was often hard and extremely painful, is part of the mythology of most diseases that are not considered shameful or demeaning. In contrast to the soft death imputed to tuberculosis, AIDS, like cancer, leads to a hard death. The metaphorized illnesses that haunt the collective imagination are all hard deaths, or envisaged, that's one of Sontag's favorite words, clearly, as such. Being deadly is not in itself enough to produce terror. It is not even necessary, as in the puzzling case of leprosy, perhaps the most stigmatized of all diseases, although rarely fatal and extremely difficult to transmit. Cancer is more feared than heart disease, although someone who has had coronary, yeah, we're going to pretend that's right, is more likely to die of heart disease in the next few years than someone who has cancer is likely to die of cancer. A heart attack is an event, but it does not give someone a new identity, turning the patient into one of them. It is not transforming, except in the sense of a transformation into something better, inspired by fear. The cardiac patient acquires good habits of exercise and diet, starts to lead a more prudent, healthier life. And it is often thought to produce, if only because it can be instantaneous, an easy death. The most terrifying illnesses are those perceived not just as lethal, but as dehumanizing, literally so. What was expressed in the rabies phobia of 19th century France, with its countless pseudo cases of contamination by animals, newly turned bestial, and even of spontaneous rabies, actual cases of rabies, la rage, were extremely rare. Was the fantasy that infection transformed people into maddened animals, unleashing uncontrollable sexual blasphemous impulses, not the fact that it was indeed, until Pasteur's discovery of a treatment in 1885, invariably fatal. So this is the second part, No One Nation, of Sontag's metaphor as illness. Like in the Kindle version I have, she combines illness as metaphor, and this other book she wrote like 10 years later called AIDS and its Metaphors, where she builds off of the other ideas. So that's what this is. And we're on section 4 of it. And while cholera killed fewer people in Western Europe in the 19th century than smallpox did, it was more feared because of the suddenness with which it struck and the indignity of the symptoms. Fulminant diarrhea and vomiting. I don't think I'm familiar with fulminant. Whose result anticipated the horror of post-mortem decomposition. I know, it's really fascinating, to be honest, as obviously morose and, like, tragic as it is. Within several hours, radical dehydration shrank the patient into a wizened caricature of his or her former self. The skin turned bluish-black. Overwhelming, transfixing fear is still, in French, un peur bleu. The body became cold. Death followed the same day or soon after. Polio's effects could be horrifying. It withered the body, but it did not mark or rot the flesh. It was not repulsive. Further, polio affected the body only, though that may seem ruin enough, not the face. The relatively appropriate, unmetaphorical reaction to polio owes much to the privileged status of the face, so determining of our evaluation of physical beauty and of physical ruin. All the debunking of the Cartesian separation of mind and body by modern philosophy and modern science has not reduced by one iota this culture's conviction of the separation of face and body, which influences every aspect of manners, fashion, sexual appreciation, aesthetic sensibility, virtually all our notions of appropriateness. I was thinking that too. I don't know if you're all familiar with Cartesian dualism. I should probably break that down a little bit because that was something I didn't know or understand, but is actually like something that I think folks talk about in many different ways, like in more like casual senses. That's like accessible, or can be at least, if explained correctly. But Cartesian dualism is the belief that our mind and our body are separate, like that they can't be understood as one, and it leads to a lot of misconceptions. Like, for instance, in a technological stance, it can be very problematic because transhumanists, like the people, at least certain ones that believe we can upload our consciousness into a machine, they believe that like that belief that we can do that is based off of a misconceived idea of mind-body dualism, as if like our mind, like our physical brain, is just like a container for our sense of self. It's very much built off of the idea of like the belief of an Abrahamic religious God and soul. So like if you don't believe in that, you're already realizing that like it may not have much ground to stand on. At least the critics argue that. So it just makes a lot of bold claims, and it's been debunked for a long time, at least in like its a claim to being like objective or factual. So that's what Sontag is referring to. Like the idea of like that being something that we understand is criticized. in a basic sense. Anyway, this separation is a main point of one of European culture's principal iconographical traditions, the depiction of Christian martyrdom, with its astounding schism between what is inscribed on the face and what is happening to the body. Yeah, I know. I mean, usually no one nation people want to do that because they believe that they'll be able to like live forever, but I've never understood that appeal either, so that's a totally legit question. Those innumerable images of Saint Sebastian, Saint Agatha, Saint Lawrence, but not of Christ himself, with the face demonstrating its effortless superiority to the atrocious things that are being inflicted down there. Below, the ruin of the body. Above, a person incarnated in the face, who looks away, usually up, not registering pain or fear already elsewhere. I know, yeah, it would be awful to be a vampire. I mean, it's very much a curse. I like that more and more vampire stories, I feel like, have been more honest about that. Only Christ, both Son of Man and Son of God, all of course capitalized in the very first letter, suffers in his face, has his passion. Our very notion of the person, of dignity, depends on the separation of face from body, on the possibility that the face may be exempt, or exempt itself, from what is happening to the body. And however lethal, illnesses like heart attacks and influenza that do not damage or deform the face, never arouse the deepest dread. Not every kind of alteration to the face is perceived as repulsive or shaming. The most dreaded are those that seem like mutations into animality to become an animal. The leper's lion face, or a kind of rot, as is syphilitis. Underlying some of the moral judgments attached to disease are aesthetic judgments about the beautiful and the ugly, the clean and the unclean, the familiar and the alien or uncanny. More accurately, these are judgments that originate before the stage at which aesthetic and moral categories slip apart or split apart and eventually come to seem opposed. What counts more than the amount of disfigurement is that it reflects underlying ongoing changes, the dissolution of the person. Smallpox, God damn it. Smallpox also disfigures, pitting the face, but the marks of smallpox don't get worse. Indeed, they are precisely the stigmata of a survivor. The marks on the face of a leper, a syphilitic, someone with AIDS, are the signs of a progressive mutation, decomposition, something organic. Sinister characterizations of the organic proliferated in the 19th century to describe both the disease and its cause. Specific diseases, such as cholera, as well as the state of being generally prone to illness, were thought to be caused by an infected or foul atmosphere, a fusion spontaneously generated from something unclean. Usually identified first by its bad smell as decaying organic matter, this disease-carrying atmosphere came to be identified with urban rather than rural squalor, and with garbage, rot, the proximity of cemeteries. These claims were eventually defeated by the discoveries by Pasteur and Koch of the role played by specific microorganisms. I think I gotta drink water. The words that I should be able to say they're not being said. All right. By 1880, the scientific community no longer believed in miasma, as these effusions were called, or in spontaneous generation. I don't know if you all are familiar with what miasma is. And I couldn't give you like a really thorough background, but a basic idea is like a belief that disease exists in the air. I mean, and of course we know that in certain capacities it does, but this one was more associated with like pagan belief. Like that was something that existed for quite a long time. Which is why, of course, like in hindsight, things like burning smoke, especially like any other type of like, whether it's Palo Santo or like sage or anything like that, like there's truth to that. Like there's a reason why that was around. But same with like, salt and all other kinds of stuff. In 1883, a year after Koch discovered the tubercular bacillus, he discovered the waterborne bacillus that causes cholera. But even after the defeat of the miasmic theory by the germ theory of contagion, miasma lived on, shorn of its first order causative status, as a kind of vague cofactor in the explanation of many illnesses. If I remember correctly, the main difference was less like a belief in some sort of small organism and more about like a belief in like ill spirits or something like that. So I should also say that too. The conviction that living in dark, dirty cities causes, or at least produces, a susceptibility to tuberculosis is a version of the miasma theory and continued to be given credence well into this century, long after the actual cause of tuberculosis had been discovered. It seems that something like what is supplied by miasma, the generalizing of infection into atmosphere, is required to moralize a disease. In the wake of its rejection by scientists, the theory inspired at least one great work of art, the Opera de Bussy. This is the internet. If the internet learns about this, they're gonna have a great time. Made from Maeterlinck's play, something in French, which is Pelleas at Melisande, a sort of Tristan and Isolde relocated in the world of miasma. It is right that Pelleas at Melisande, in which everyone avows feelings of weakness and being lost, and some are already ailing, with its old decaying castle that lets in no light, where the ground is full of subterranean terrors and dank of watery depths, into which one can fall, all the correlatives of miasma, minus the stench, seems to us supremely a portrait of psychological sickness, of neurosis. For precisely as the category of generic sickliness was phased out of 19th century medical thinking, but the new understanding of the extreme specificity of what causes illness, it migrated to the expanding domain of psychology. The physically sickly person became the or neurotic person, and the idea of an organically contaminated, objectively pathogenic environment reappeared, and the notion of a psychologically contaminated ambiance that produced a disposition to mental illness. The notion did not remain confined to the domain of psychology, and with psychology's new credibility as science, returned to re-influence medicine. The widely held view that many or even most diseases are not really physical but mental, more conservatively psychosomatic, perpetuates the form of the miasma theory with its surplus of causality, surplus of meaning, in a new version that has been extremely successful in the 20th century. The theory that psychological miasma, depression, funk can cause physical illness has been tried out with varying degrees of respectability on many diseases, including cancer. And one way in which AIDS, some of whose metaphors overlap those of cancer, seems very different from cancer. That illness saturated with distinctively modern evaluations of energy and of disaster, and is experienced as a throwback to pre-modern diseases like leprosy and syphilis, is that no one is tempted, not yet at least, to psychologize it. Yeah, I guess I haven't seen that at all with cancer now that I think about it. Uh-oh. Sorry, TikTok. All right, that's 4. Let me get some tea and some water. A little bit of dehydration, a little bit of hydration. I got some black tea. Or no, it's Lady Grey, but I mean that is a type of black tea, I guess. To be specific. To be specific. God damn it, mouse. My computer gets on my absolute last nerve, I swear. All right, continuing on. Section 5, and of course, as I said, I think at the beginning, there's a little sentence write-up if anyone is interested in what we're reading. That's over on the Twitch. There's always a better view. There's more in one screen, all the stuff happening. So, 5. Plague is the principal metaphor by which the AIDS epidemic is understood, and because of AIDS, the popular misidentification of cancer as an epidemic, even a plague, seems to be receding. AIDS has banalized, I can never say this as one word, banalized cancer. Plague from the Latin plaga, stroke, wound, has long been used metaphorically as the highest standard of collective calamity, evil, scourge, precopus? Procopius, in his masterpiece of or Calamity, the secret history, called the Emperor Justinian worse than the plague. Fewer escaped, as well as being a general name for many frightening diseases. Although the disease to which the word is permanently affixed produced the most lethal of recorded epidemics, being experienced as a pitiless slayer is not necessary for a disease to be regarded as plague-like. Leprosy, very rarely fatal now, was not much more so when at its greatest epidemic strength between about 1050 and 1350. And syphilis has been regarded as a plague. Blake speaks of the youthful harlot's curse that blights with plagues the marriage hearse, not because it killed often, but because it was disgracing, disempowering, disgusting. It is usually epidemics that are thought of as plagues, and these mass incidences of illness are understood as inflicted, not just endured. Considering illness as a punishment is the oldest idea of what causes illness, and an idea opposed by all intention to the ill that deserves the noble name of medicine. Hippocrates, who wrote several treatises on epidemics, specifically ruled out the wrath of God as a cause of bubonic plague, but the illnesses interpreted in antiquity as punishments, like the plague of Oedipus, were not thought to be shameful, as leprosy and subsequently syphilis were to be. Diseases, insofar as they acquired meaning, were collective calamities and judgments on a community. Only injuries and disabilities, not diseases, were thought of as individually merited. For an analogy in the literature of antiquity to the modern sense of a shaming, isolating disease, one would have to turn to Philoctetes and his stinking wound. The most feared diseases, those are not simply fatal but transform the body into something alienating, like leprosy and syphilis and cholera, and in the imagination of many, cancer, are the ones that seem particularly susceptible to promotion to plague. Leprosy and syphilis were the first illnesses to be consistently described as repulsive. It was syphilis that, in the earliest depictions by doctors at the end of the 15th century, generated a version of the metaphors that flourish around AIDS, of a disease that was not only repulsive and retributive. I don't know, I can't say words tonight, y'all. Retributive, but collectively invasive. Although Erasmus, the most influential European pedagogue of the early 16th century, described syphilis as nothing but a kind of leprosy, by 1529 he called it something worse than leprosy. It had already been understood as something different because sexually transmitted. Paracelsus speaks in Donne's paraphrase of that foul contagious disease which then had invaded mankind in a few places and since overflows in all, that for punishment of general licentiousness God first inflicted that disease. Thinking of syphilis as a punishment for an individual's transgression was for a long time, virtually until the disease became easily curable, not really distinct from regarding it as retribution for the licentiousness of a community, as with AIDS now, in the rich industrial countries. In contrast to cancer, understood in a modern way as a disease incurred by and revealing of individuals, AIDS is understood in a pre-modern way, as a disease incurred by people both as individuals and as members of a risk group. That neutral-sounding, bureaucratic category, which also revives the archaic idea of a tainted community that illness has judged. I know, what a good way to describe that. Not every account of plague or plague-like diseases, of course, is a vehicle for lurid stereotypes about illness and the ill. The effort to think critically, historically, about illness, about disaster generally, was attempted throughout the 18th century, say from Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, 1722, to Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed, 1827. Defoe's historical fiction, purporting to be an eyewitness account of bubonic plague in London in 1665, does not further any understanding of the plague as punishment, or a later part of the script, as a transforming experience. And Manzoni, in his lengthy account of the passage of plague through the Duchy, that's literally what she called it, of Milan in 1630, is avowedly committed to presenting a more accurate, less reductive view than his historical sources. But even these two complex narratives reinforce some of the perennial simplifying ideas about plague. One feature of the usual script for plague: the disease invariably comes from somewhere else. The names for syphilis, when it began its epidemic sweep through Europe in the last decade of the 15th century, are an exemplary illustration of the need to make a dreaded disease foreign. It was the French pox to the English, morbus Germanicus to the Parisians, the Nepal's sickness to the Florentines, the Chinese disease to the Japanese. Does this sound familiar? But what may seem like a joke about the inevitability of chauvinism reveals a more important truth: that there is a link between imagining disease and imagining foreignness. It lies perhaps in the very concept of wrong, which is archaically identical with the non wait yeah the known us. Oh, the non-us. Sorry, again, it's a word that they divided up with a hyphen and then split into two lines. I didn't stand a chance. The alien. A polluting person is always wrong, as Mary Douglas has observed. The inverse is also true. A person judged to be wrong is regarded as, at least potentially, a source of pollution. The foreign place of origin of important illnesses, as of drastic changes in the weather, may be no more remote than a neighboring country. Illness is a species of invasion, and indeed is often carried by soldiers. Manzoni's account of the plague of 1630, chapters 31 to 37, begins: "The plague which the Tribunal of Health had feared might enter the Milanese provinces with the German troops had in fact entered, as is well known, and it is also well known that it did not stop there, but went on to invade and depopulate a large part of Italy." Defoe's chronicle of the plague of 1665 begins similarly, with a flurry of ostentatiously scrupulous speculation about its foreign origin. It was about the beginning of September 1664 that I, among the rest of my neighbors, heard in ordinary discourse that the plague was returned again in Holland, for it had been very violent there, and particularly at Amsterdam and Rotterdam in the year 1663, whither, they say, it was brought. Some said from Italy, others from the Levant, among some goods which were brought home by their Turkey fleet. Others said it was brought from Candia, others from Cyprus. It mattered not from whence it came, but all agreed it was come into Holland again. The bubonic plague that reappeared in London in 1720s had arrived from Marseille, which was where plague in the 18th century was usually thought to enter Western Europe. Brought by seamen, then transported by soldiers and merchants. By the 19th century, the foreign origin was usually more exotic, the means by transport less specifically imagined, and the illness itself had become phantasmagorical, symbolic. What a good fucking word. At the end of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov dreams of plague. He dreamt that the whole world was condemned to a terrible new strange plague that had come to Europe from the depths of Asia. At the beginning of the sentence, it is the whole world, which turns out by the end of the sentence to be Europe, inflicted by a lethal visitation from Asia. I swear I especially can't say people's names that I haven't read regularly anymore. Dostoevsky's model is undoubtedly cholera, called Asiatic cholera, long endemic in Bengal, which had rapidly become and remained through most of the 19th century a worldwide epidemic disease. Part of a centuries-old conception of Europe as a privileged cultural entity is that it is a place which is colonized by lethal diseases coming from elsewhere. Europe is assumed to be by rights free of disease, and Europeans have been astoundingly callous about the far more devastating extent to which they, as invaders, as colonists, have introduced their lethal diseases to the exotic, primitive world. Think of the ravages of smallpox, influenza, and cholera on the aboriginal populations of the Americas and Australia. Say that, Sontag, say it! The tenacity of the connection of exotic origin with dreaded disease is one reason why cholera, of which there were 4 great outbreaks in Europe in the 19th century, each with a lower death toll than the preceding one, has continued to be more memorable than smallpox, whose ravages increased as the century went on. 500,000 dead in the European smallpox pandemic of the early 1870s, but which could not be construed as plague-like, a disease with a non-European origin. Plagues are no longer sent, as in biblical and Greek antiquity, from the question of agency has blurred. Instead, peoples are visited by plagues, and the visitations recur, as is taken for granted in the subtitle of Defoe's narrative, which explains that it is about that which happened in London during the last great visitation in 1665. Even for non-Europeans, lethal disease may be called a visitation, but a visitation on them is invariably described as different from one on us. I believe that about one half of the whole people was carried off by this visitation, wrote the English traveler Alexander Kinglake, reaching Cairo at a time of the bubonic plague, sometimes called Oriental plague. The Orientals, capital O, however, have more quiet fortitude than Europeans under afflictions of this sort. Kinglake's influential book, Otheon, it's like Ethan, but there's a O after the E. Oethen, 1844, suggestively subtitled Traces of Travel Brought Home from the East, illustrates many of the enduring Eurocentric presumptions about others, starting from the fantasy that peoples with little reason to expect exemption from misfortune have a lessened capacity to feel misfortune. Thus it is believed that Asians, or the poor, or blacks, or Africans, or Muslims, sick, which means their words, don't suffer or don't grieve as Europeans or whites do. The fact that illness is associated with the poor, who are from the perspective of the privileged aliens in one's midst, reinforces the association of illness with the foreign, with an exotic, often primitive place, thus illustrating the classic script for plague. AIDS is thought to have started in the Dark Continent, then spread to Haiti, then to the United States and to Europe. Then it is understood as a tropical disease, another infestation from the so-called Third World, which is after all where most people in the world live, as well as a scourge of the treaties tropiques. Also, fuck that language of the first and third world, by the way. That's definitely garbage. Africans who detect racist stereotypes in much of the speculation about the geographical origins of AIDS are not wrong. Nor are they wrong in thinking that depictions of Africa as the cradle of AIDS must feed anti-African prejudices in Europe and Asia. The subliminal connection made to notions about a primitive past and the many hypotheses that have been fielded about possible transmission from animals, a disease of green monkeys, African swine fever, cannot help but activate a similar set of stereotypes about I can't fucking say it. Animality. There we go. All right. Sexual license and blacks. Again, sick. We have the language needs an update. Sontag. In Zaire and other countries in Central Africa where AIDS is killing tens of thousands, the counter-reaction has begun. Many doctors, academics, journalists, government officials, and other educated people believe that the virus was sent to Africa from the United States, an act of bacteriological warfare whose aim was to decrease the African birth rate, which got out of hand and has returned to afflict its perpetrators. A common African version of this belief about the disease's provenance has the virus fabricated in a CIA Army laboratory in Maryland, sent from there to Africa, and brought back to its country of origin by American homosexual missionaries returning from Africa to Maryland. At first, it was assumed that AIDS must become widespread elsewhere in the same catastrophic form in which it has emerged in Africa, and those who still think this will eventually happen invariably invoke the Black Death. The plague metaphor is an essential vehicle of the most pessimistic reading of the epidemiological prospects. From classic fiction to the latest journalism, the standard plague story is of inexorably inescapability. The unprepared are taken by surprise. Those observing the recommended precautions are struck down as well. All succumb when the story is told by an omniscient narrator, as in Poe's parable, The Masque of the Red Death, 1842, inspired by an account of a ball held in Paris during the cholera epidemic of 1832. Almost all, if the story is told from the point of view of a traumatized witness, who will be a benumbed survivor, as in Jean Giano's Stendhalen novel, Horseman on the Roof, 1951, in which a young Italian nobleman in exile wanders through cholera-stricken southern France in the 1830s. Plagues are invariably regarded as judgments on society, and the metaphoric inflation of AIDS into such a judgment also accustoms people to the inevitability of global spread. This is a traditional use of sexually transmitted diseases to be described as punishments, not just of individuals, but of a group. General lasciviousness. Not only venereal diseases have been used this way to identify transgressing or vicious populations. Interpreting any catastrophic epidemic as a sign of moral laxity or political decline was as common until the later part of the last century as associating dreaded diseases with foreignness, or with despised and feared minorities. And the assignment of fault is not contradicted by cases that do not fit. The Methodist preachers in England who connected the cholera epidemic of 1832 with drunkenness, the temperance movement was just starting, were not understood to be claiming that everybody who got cholera was a drunkard. There's always room for innocent victims, children, young women. Tuberculosis, in its identity as a disease of the poor rather than of the sensitive, was also linked by late 19th century reformers to alcoholism. Responses to illnesses associated with sinners and the poor invariably recommended the adoption of middle-class values, the regular habits, productivity, and emotional self-control to which drunkenness was thought the chief impediment. Health itself is eventually identified with these values, which were religious as well as mercantile, health being evidence of virtue as disease was of depravity. The dictum that cleanliness is next to godliness is to be taken quite literally. The succession of cholera epidemics in the 19th century shows a steady waning of religious interpretations of the disease. More precisely, these increasingly coexisted with other explanations. Although by the time of the epidemic in 1866, cholera was commonly understood not simply as a divine punishment, but as the consequence of remediable defects of sanitation, it was still regarded as the scourge of the sinful. A writer in the New York Times declared April 22nd, 1866, cholera is especially the punishment of neglect of sanitary laws. It is the curse of the dirty, the intemperate, and the degraded. That it now seems unimaginable for cholera or a similar disease to be regarded in this way signifies not a lessened capacity to moralize about diseases, but only a change in the kind of illnesses that are used didactically. Cholera was perhaps the last major epidemic disease fully qualifying for plague status for almost a century. I mean, cholera as a European and an American, therefore a 19th century disease. Until 1817, there had never been a cholera epidemic outside the Far East. Influenza, which would seem more plague-like than any other epidemic in this century, if loss of life were the main criterion, and which struck as suddenly as cholera and killed as quickly, usually in a few days, was never viewed metaphorically as a plague. Nor was a more recent epidemic polio. One reason why plague notions were not invoked is that these epidemics did not have enough of the attributes perennially described to plagues. For instance, polio was construed as typically a disease of children, of the innocent. The more important reason is that there has been a shift in the focus of the moralistic exploitation of illness. Interesting. This shift to diseases that can be interpreted as judgments on the individual makes it harder to use epidemic disease as such. For a long time, cancer was the illness that best fitted the secular culture's need to blame and punish and censor through the imagery of disease. Cancer was a disease of an individual and understood as the result not of an action, but rather of a failure to act, to be prudent, to exert proper self-control, or to be properly expressive. In the 20th century, it's become almost impossible to moralize about epidemics, except those which are transmitted sexually. The persistence of the belief that illness reveals, and is a punishment for, moral laxity or turpitude can be seen in another way, by noting the persistence of descriptions of disorder or corruption as a disease. So indispensable has been the plague metaphor in bringing summary judgments about social crisis, that its use hardly abated during the era when collective diseases were no longer treated as moralistically treated so moralistically. The time between the influenza and encephalitis pandemics of the early and mid 1920s and the acknowledgement of a new mysterious epidemic illness in the early 1980s, and when great infectious epidemics were so often and confidently proclaimed a thing of the past. The plague metaphor was common in the 1930s as a synonym for social and psychic catastrophe. Evocations of plague of this type usually go with anti-liberal attitudes. Think of R. Todd on theater and plague, of Wilhelm Reich on emotional plague. And such a generic diagnosis necessarily promotes anti-historical thinking. A theodicy, I don't think I've ever seen that either, as well as a demonology. It not only stipulates something emblematic of evil, but makes this the bearer of a rough, terrible justice. In Karel Capek's The White Plague, 1937, the loathsome pestilence that has appeared in a state where fascism has come to power afflicts only those over the age of 40, those who could be held morally responsible. we need a remake. Written on the eve of the Yahtzee takeover of Czechoslovakia. Oh, this is about to be really close to my home. Capek's allegorical play is something of an anomaly. The use of the plague metaphor to convey the menace of what is defined as barbaric by a mainstream European liberal. The play's mysterious grisly malady is something like leprosy, a rapid, invariably fatal leprosy that is supposed to have come, of course, from Asia. But Capek is not interested in identifying political evil with the incursion of the foreign. He scores his didactic points by focusing not on the disease itself, but on the management of information about it by scientists, journalists, and politicians. The most famous specialist in the disease harangues a reporter, the disease of the hour, you might say. A good 5 million have died of it today. 20 million have it, and at least 3 times as many are going about their business, blithely unaware of the marble-like, marble-sized spots on their bodies. Chides a fellow doctor for using the popular terms the white plague and pecking leprosy instead of the scientific name, the Chang syndrome, fantasizes about how his clinics work at identifying the new virus and finding a cure. Every clinic in the world has an intensive research program, will add to the prestige of science, and win a Nobel Prize for its discoverer, revels in hyperbole when it is thought a cure has been found. It was the most dangerous disease in all history, worse than the bubonic plague, and outlines plans for sending those with symptoms to well-guarded detention camps. Given that every carrier of the disease is a potential spreader of the disease, we must protect the uncontaminated from the contaminated. All sentimentality in this regard is fatal and therefore criminal. However cartoonish Capek's ironies may seem, they are a not improbable sketch of catastrophe, medical, ecological, as a managed public event in modern mass society. And however conventionally he deploys the plague metaphor as an agency of retribution, in the end the plague strikes down the dictator himself. Capek's feel for public relations leads him to make explicit in the play the understanding of disease as a metaphor. The eminent doctor declares the accomplishments of science to be as nothing compared with the merits of the dictator about to launch a war, who has averted a far worse scourge, the scourge of anarchy, the leprosy of corruption, the epidemic of barbaric liberty, the plague of social disintegration, fatally sapping the organism of our nation. Camus' The Plague, which appeared a decade later, is a far less literal use of plague by another great European liberal, as subtle as Capek's The White Plague is schematic. Camus' novel is not, as is sometimes said, a political allegory, in which the outbreak of bubonic plague as a Mediterranean port city represents the Yahtzee occupation. This plague is not retributive. Retributive. I can't say that either for some reason. Camus is not protesting anything, not corruption or tyranny, not even morality. The plague is no more or less than an exemplary event, the eruption of death that gives life its seriousness. His use of plague, more epitome than metaphor, is detached, stoic, aware. It is not about bringing judgment. But as in Capek's play, characters in Camus' novel declare how unthinkable it is to have a plague in the 20th century, as if the belief that such a calamity could not happen anymore, means that it must. It didn't go where I thought it might go when it mentioned the Yazidis in Czechoslovakia, but it still went somewhere. Time to drink our water before we start part 6. As usual, if anyone has any questions, let me know. I've been stopping, I think, whenever I'm like, wait a second, is this understood? Let me say it as much for myself as a reminder as for anyone who may be listening now or later. All right. I don't know why my forearms are like strangely sore. I gotta find like a better way to be playing Stardew Valley so that apparently I'm not wearing myself out. All right, part 6. The emergence of a new catastrophic epidemic, when for several decades it had been confidently assumed that such calamities belonged to the past, would not be enough to revive the moralistic inflation of an epidemic into a plague. It was necessary that the epidemic be one whose most common means of transmission is sexual. Cotton Mather called syphilis a punishment which the just judgment of God has reserved for our late ages. From what I remember, that dude fucking sucked. That's all you really need to know about Cotton Mather. Dude fucking sucked. Recalling this and other nonsense uttered about syphilis from the end of the 15th to the early 20th centuries, one should hardly be surprised that many want to view AIDS metaphorically as plague-like, a moral judgment on society. I think that the book, which one was it? I'm pretty sure I read a book that mentioned it was like a whole section on Cotton Mather. I don't remember if it was by Kendi. If I remember, I'll post it somewhere, like on Twitter or something. The book was important, and people should know who in history, if cited, is very problematic. So it's important. Professional fulminators can't resist the rhetorical opportunity offered by a sexually transmitted disease that is lethal. Thus, the fact that AIDS is predominantly a heterosexually transmitted illness in the countries where it first emerged in the epidemic form has not prevented such guardians of public morals as Jesse Helms and Norman Podhortz from depicting it as a visitation specifically aimed and deserved incurred by Western homosexuals, while another Reagan-era celebrity, Pat Buchanan, orates about AIDS and moral bankruptcy, and Jerry Falwell offers the generic diagnosis that AIDS is God's judgment on a society that does not live by his rules. Fuck all that. Also, happy day 15 of Gay Pride. What is surprising is not that the AIDS epidemic has been exploited in this way, but that such cant has been confined to so predictably a sector of bigots. The official discourse about AIDS invariably includes admonitions against bigotry. The pronouncements of those who claim to speak for God can mostly be discounted as the rhetoric regularly prompted by sexually transmitted illness, from Cotton Mather's judgment to recent statements by two leading Brazilian clerics, Bishop Falácio of Brasilia, who declares AIDS to be the consequence of moral decadence, and the Cardinal of Rio de Janeiro, Eugenio Sales, who wants it both ways, describing AIDS as God's punishment and as the revenge of nature. More interesting, because their purposes are more complex, are the secular sponsors of this sort of invective. Authoritarian political ideologies have a vested interest in promoting fear. A sense of the imminence of takeover by aliens and real diseases are useful material. Keep in mind, right, that the other book that I guess last week I started on Thursday. or maybe the week before, I don't remember. The Lonely Century talked at length and I think pairs well with what Sontag is saying here. Epidemic diseases usually elicit a call to ban the entry of foreigners, immigrants, and xenophobic propaganda has always depicted immigrants as bearers of disease. In the late 19th century, cholera, yellow fever, typhoid fever, tuberculosis. It seems logical that the political figure in France, who represents the most extreme nativist, racist views, Jean-Marie Le Pen, has attempted a strategy of fomenting fear of this new alien peril, insisting that AIDS is not just infectious but contagious, and calling for mandatory nationwide testing and the quarantine of everyone carrying the virus. And AIDS is a gift to the present regime in South Africa, whose foreign minister declared recently, evoking the incidence of the illness among the mine workers imported from neighboring all-black countries. The terrorists are now coming to us with a weapon more terrible than Marxism, AIDS. What a fucking jerk. Like, what a just absolute terrible human. The AIDS epidemic serves as an ideal projection for first world political paranoia. Not only is the so-called AIDS virus the quintessential invader from the third world, it can stand for any mythological menace. In this country, AIDS has so far evoked less pointedly racist reactions than in Europe, including the Soviet Union, where the African origin of the disease is stressed. Here it is as much a reminder of feelings associated with the menace of the second world as it is an image of being overrun by the third. Predictably, the public voices in this country most committed to drawing moral lessons from the AIDS epidemic, such as Norman Podhoretz, are those whose main theme is worry about America's will to maintain its bellicosity. Bellicosity? I don't know. Its expenditures on armaments, its firm anti-communist stance, and who find everywhere evidence of the decline of American political and imperial authority. Denunciations of the gay plague are part of a much larger complaint, common among anti-liberals in the West and many exiles from the Russian bloc about contemporary permissiveness of all kinds, a now familiar diatribe against the soft West, with its hedonism, its vulgar, sexy music, its indulgence in drugs, its disabled family life, which have sapped the will to stand up to communism. What a fucking sentence. AIDS is a favorite concern of those who translate their political agenda into questions of group psychology, of national self-esteem and self-confidence. Although these specialists in ugly feelings insist that AIDS is a punishment for deviant sex, what moves them is not just or even principally homophobia. Even more important is the utility of AIDS in pursuing one of the main activities of the so-called neoconservatives, the Kulturkampf against all that is called, for short and inaccurately, the 1960s. A whole politics of the will, of intolerance, of paranoia, of fear of political weakness, has fastened on this disease. Age is such an apt goad to familiar, consensus-building fears that have been cultivated for several generations, like fear of subversion, and to fears that have surfaced more recently of uncontrollable pollution and of unstoppable migration from the third world, that it would seem inevitable that AIDS would be envisaged in this society as something total, civilization threatening. And raising the disease's metaphorical stature by keeping alive fears of its easy transmissibility, its imminent spread, does not diminish its status as mainly a consequence of illicit acts or of economic and cultural backwardness. That it is a punishment for deviant behavior and that it threatens the innocent, these two notions about AIDS are hardly in contradiction. Such is the extraordinary potency and efficacy of the plague metaphor. It allows a disease to be regarded both as something incurred by vulnerable others and as potentially everyone's disease. Still, it is one thing to emphasize how the disease menaces everybody in order to incite fear and confirm prejudice, quite another to argue in order to diffuse prejudice and reduce stigma, that eventually AIDS will directly or indirectly affect everybody. Recently, these same mythologists who have been eager to use AIDS for ideological mobilization against deviants have backed away from the most panic-inspiring estimates of the illness. They are among the most vocal of those who insist that infection will not spread to the general population and have turned their attention to denouncing hysteria or frenzy about AIDS. Behind what they now consider the excessive publicity given the disease, they discern the desire to placate an all-powerful minority by agreeing to regard their disease as ours, further evidence of the sway of nefarious liberal values and of America's spiritual decline. Making AIDS everyone's problem and therefore a subject on which everyone needs to be educated, charge the anti-liberal AIDS mythologists, subverts our understanding of the difference between us and them. Indeed, exculpates, or at least makes irrelevant, moral judgments about them. In such rhetoric, the disease continues to be identified almost exclusively with homosexuality, and specifically the practice of sodomy. Has America become a country where classroom discussion of the Ten Commandments is impermissible, but teacher instructions in safe sodomy are to be mandatory? Inquires Pat Buchanan, protesting the foolish proposal made in the report of the recent Presidential Commission on the Epidemic, chaired by Admiral Watkins, to outlaw discrimination against people with AIDS. It's all just the same shit, I swear. They're always just saying the same shit over and over and over again in a new era. Like, not the disease, but the appeals heard from the most official quarters to set aside prejudice and fear in favor of compassion, the words of the Watkins report, have become a principal target, suggesting as they do a weakening of the society's power or willingness to punish and segregate through judgments about sexual behavior. Like, I heard when I was still on that audio app Clubhouse, I heard people all the time when I would, like, we'd be talking about sex education, specifically comprehensive sex ed, because obviously that's medically accurate and actually going to talk about a wide breadth of information that is, once again, actually medically accurate, unlike abstinence only. That's the kind of shit people would say when I'm like, there's age-appropriate forms of comprehensive sex ed. It's not like we're going in and we're like, this is how you, like, do some sort of explicit sexual act, small child. It's like talking about consent. Like, it's basic things, and they're always responding with nonsense, like just what we heard on that last page. To this day. Like, more than cancer, but rather like syphilis, AIDS seems to foster ominous fantasies about a disease that is a marker of both individual and social vulnerabilities. The virus invades the body. The disease, or in the newer version, the fear of the disease, is described as invading the whole society. In late 1986, President Reagan pronounced AIDS to be spreading insidiously, of course, through the length and breadth of our society. But AIDS, while the pretext for existing dark intimations about the body politic, has yet to seem credible as a political metaphor for internal enemies, even in France, where AIDS, in French, le sida, was quickly added to the store of political invective. Le Pen has dismissed some of his opponents as AIDS-ish, sidatique, and the anti-liberal polemicist Louis Pauwels said that lycée students on strike last year were suffering from mental AIDS. Sont atteints d'un sida mental. Neither has AIDS proved of much use as a metaphor for international political evil. True Jean Kirkpatrick once couldn't resist comparing international terrorism to AIDS, but such sallies are rare. Perhaps because for that purpose the cancer metaphor has proved so fecund. This doesn't mean that AIDS is not used preposterously as a metaphor, but only that AIDS has a metaphoric potential different from that of cancer. When the movie director in Elaine Tanner's film La Vallée Fantôme, 1787, muses, cinema is like a cancer, and then corrects himself, no, it's infectious, it's more like AIDS. The comparison seems lumberingly self-conscious, as well as a decided underuse of AIDS. Not of its infectiousness, but its characteristic latency offers a more distinctive use of AIDS as a metaphor. Thus, the Palestinian-Israeli writer Anton Shamas in the Jerusalem Weekly, Kol Hair, in a fit of medical, sexual, and political fantasy, recently described Israel's Declaration of Independence of 1948 as the AIDS of the Jewish state in the land of Israel, whose long incubation has produced Emunim and Rabbi Meir Kahane. That is where it all began, and that is where it will end. AIDS, I am sorry to say, despite my sympathy for homosexuals, affects mainly monoerotics, and a mono-national Jewish state contains by definition the seeds of its own destruction, the collapse of the political immune system that we call democracy. Rock Hudson, who once was as beautiful as a Palmachnik. I don't know what any of this is, by the way. This is all a block quote. Rock Hudson, who once was as beautiful as Palmachik, now lies dying long after the dissolution of the Palmach. The state of Israel, for Jews of course, was indeed once beautiful. Dude sounds like a bad guy though, from what I can gather with my limited knowledge. And even more promising than its connection with latency is the potential of AIDS as a metaphor for contamination and mutation. Cancer is still common as a metaphor for what is feared or deplored, even if the illness is less dreaded than before. If AIDS can eventually be drafted for comparable use, it will be because AIDS is not only invasive, a trait it shares with cancer, or even because it is infectious, but because of the specific imagery that surrounds viruses. Virology supplies a new set of medical metaphors, independent of AIDS, which nevertheless reinforce the AIDS mythology. It was years before AIDS that William Burroughs oracly declared, and Laurie Anderson echoed, language is a virus. And the viral explanation is invoked more and more often. Until recently, most of the infections recognized as viral ones, like rabies and influenza, that have very rapid effects. But the category of slow-acting viral infections is growing. Many progressive and invariably fatal disorders of the central nervous system, and some degenerative disease of the brain that can appear in old age, as well as the so-called autoimmune diseases. It's so weird to hear someone say, like so-called, are now suspected of being, in fact, slow virus diseases. And evidence continues to accumulate for a viral cause of at least some human cancers. Notions of conspiracy translate well into metaphors of implacable, insidious, infinitely patient viruses. It's just, like I said, it's so weird reading this, like, 60, 70 years later, where it's like, we know that that's true. Like, she's saying it because it's just recently been discovered around the late 70s, late 80s, I guess. In contrast to bacteria, which are relatively complex organisms, viruses are described as an extremely primitive form of life. At the same time, their activities are far more complex than those envisaged, like I said, that's her favorite word, in the earlier germ models of infection. Viruses are not simply agents of infection and contamination. They transport genetic information, they transform cells, and they themselves, many of them, evolve. While the smallpox virus appears to stay constant for centuries, influenza viruses evolve so rapidly that vaccines need to be modified every year to keep up with changes in the surface coat of the virus. The virus, or more accurately, viruses thought to cause AIDS, are at least as mutable as the influenza viruses. Indeed, virus is now a synonym for change. We see that now with the internet, again, a few decades before the internet. It was in the works, I guess, then, though. Linda Ronstadt, recently explaining why she prefers doing Mexican folk music to rock and roll, observed, "We don't have any tradition in contemporary music except change, mutate like a virus." So far as plague still has a future as a metaphor, it is through the ever more familiar notion of the virus. Perhaps no disease in the future caused by a bacillus will be considered as plague-like. Information itself, now inextricably linked to the powers of computers, it's so funny to see, is threatened by something compared to a virus. Rogue or pirate programs, known as software viruses, are, are described as paralleling the behavior of biological viruses, which can capture the genetic code of parts of an organism and affect transfers of alien genetic material. These programs, deliberately planted onto a floppy disk, meant to be used with the computer or introduced when the computer is communicating over telephone lines or data networks with other computers, copy themselves onto the computer's operating system. Like their biological namesakes, they won't produce immediate signs of damage to the computer's memory, which gives the newly infected program time to spread to other computers. Such metaphors drawn from virology, partly stimulated by the omnipresence of talk of AIDS, are turning up everywhere. I guess I really never thought about the connection of the language of metaphors of AIDS and the emergence of computers. That's actually like super fascinating if you ask me. The virus that destroyed a considerable amount of data at the Student Computer Center at Leahy University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1987 was given the name PC AIDS. In France, computer specialists already speak of the problem of Listeria informatique, and they transform the sense of the omnipresence of AIDS. It is perhaps not surprising that the newest transforming element in the modern world, computers, should be borrowing metaphors drawn from our newest transforming illness. Exactly! Yeah, Sontag, exactly. Nor is it surprising that descriptions of the course of viral infection now often echo the language of the computer age, as when it is said that a virus will normally produce new copies of itself. In addition to the mechanistic descriptions, the way viruses are animalistically characterized as a menace in waiting, as mutable, as furtive, as biologically innovative, reinforces the sense that disease can be something ingenious, unpredictable, novel. Those metaphors are central to ideas about AIDS that distinguish this illness from others that have been regarded as plague-like. For though the fears AIDS represents are old, its status as that unexpected event, an entirely new disease, a new judgment, as it were, adds to the dread. That, like, really, like, that particular section really adds to, like, what I'm trying to get at with, combining, like, with immediate ecological perspective critically, the way that, like, the world truly right now with this virus is it's an environment. Like the way that COVID has affected us is so distinct because of the existence of the internet during a pandemic for the first time in human history. That's really what I'm getting at in the algorithmic age, and like especially now with all the denialism and the effects on our relations as any technology does ecologically. Like that's exactly, wow, that's a perfect section for me to reference in making that argument. I didn't know she talks about this, but I didn't know what she talked about, I guess. Because, like I said before, I read the beginning of Illness as Metaphor before, now that for anyone just joining, we're reading what's up on the Twitch thing. Oh, my tea's running out. We're reading AIDS and its Metaphors, which Sontag wrote like 10 years after Illness as Metaphor, from what I understand. And as it suggests, other than the first one, Illness as Metaphor, that primarily covered tuberculosis and cancer, and its use as metaphor in society and like the way that it influences our understanding and response. This one, as it suggests again, it primarily refers to the way that AIDS did that, and that's really what I'm trying to get at with the COVID environment, like just the COVID era and how much it changes everything about how we've known ourselves and how we relate to each other now. All right, next section. I think I'm probably going to read like a couple more because they're pretty short. We got like 45 minutes, and then I might play more Stardew Valley. We'll see. I know, doesn't it, right? Arkosavi, I like that name. Thanks for being here. All right, section 7. This is a quote from Sir Thomas Browne. Some will allow no diseases, capital D, to be new. Others think that many old ones are ceased, and that such which are esteemed new will have but their time. However, the mercy of God hath scattered the great heap of diseases, and not loaded any one country with all. Some may be new in one country, which has been old in another. New discoveries of the earth discover new diseases, and if Asia, Africa, and America should bring in their list, Pandora's box would swell, and there must be a strange pathology. A letter to a friend upon occasion of the death of his intimate friend. It is, of course, unlikely that AIDS, first identified in the early 1980s, is a new disease. Most probably the virus has been around a long time, and not only in Africa, though it is only recently, and in Africa, that the disease has attained epidemic volume. But for general consciousness, it is a new disease, and for medicine too. AIDS marks a turning point in current attitudes toward illness and medicine, as well as towards sexuality and toward catastrophe. Medicine had been viewed as an age-old military campaign, now nearing its final phase, leading to victory. The emergence of a new epidemic disease, one for several decades, it had been confidently assumed that such calamities belonged to the past, has inevitably changed the status of medicine. The advent of AIDS has made it clear that the infectious diseases are far from conquered and their roster far from closed. Medicine changed mores. Illness is changing them back. Contraception and the assurance by medicine of the easy curability of sexually transmitted diseases, as of almost all infectious diseases, made it possible to regard sex as an adventure without consequences. Now AIDS obliges people to think of sex as having, possibly, the direst consequences: unaliving or murder. There was a trial run for the conversion of sexuality to something dangerous, and the wildly diffused panic about herpes in the United States in the early 1980s. And herpes in most cases is merely awful, erotically disqualifying. The fear of AIDS imposed on an act whose ideal is an experience of pure presentness and a creation of the future, a relation to the past to be ignored at one's peril. Sex no longer withdraws its partners, if only for a moment, from the social. It cannot be considered just a coupling. It is a chain of transmission from the past. So remember, when a person has sex, they're not just having it with that partner, they're having it with everybody that partner had it with for the past 10 years. This is a quote, by the way. Runs an endearingly gender-vague pronouncement made in 1987 by Secretary of Health and Human Services, Dr. Otis R. Bowen. Okay, way to do the family name wrong. Like, I didn't know that someone with my last name is responsible for sharing that awful quote that I've heard repeated out of context too many times between my birth and now. Jesus. AIDS reveals all but long-term monogamous sex as promiscuous, therefore dangerous, and also as deviant, for all heterosexual relations are also homosexual ones once removed. Fear of sexuality is the new disease sponsor register of the universe of fear in which everyone now lives. Cancer phobia taught us the fear of a polluting environment. Now we have the fear of polluting people that AIDS anxiety inevitably communicates. Fear of the communion cup, fear of surgery, fear of contaminated blood, whether Christ's blood or your neighbor's, life, blood, sexual fluids, it is itself the bearer of contamination. These fluids are potentially lethal. Better to abstain. People are storing their own blood for future use. The model of altruistic behavior in our society, giving blood anonymously, has been compromised, since no one can be sure about anonymous blood received. Not only does AIDS have the unhappy effect of reinforcing American moralism about sex, it further strengthens the culture of self-interest, which is much of what is usually praised as individualism. Self-interest now receives an added boost as simple medical prudence. This is what I'm also talking about in regards to COVID. Like, it's truly, I mean, that's why it wasn't a coincidence that I was writing a dissertation about sexual ecologies and then the COVID hit, and then I was like, oh, fuck. Like, this is really going to change everything, truly, in a way that was already influenced by all this. All rapid epidemics, including those in which there is no suspicion of sexual transmission or any culpabilizing of the ill, give rise to roughly similar practices of avoidance and exclusion. In the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 19, influenza is a highly communicable disease caused by an airborne virus, transmitted via the respiratory system. People were advised against shaking hands and urged to put handkerchiefs over their mouths when kissing. Police officers were ordered to don gauze masks before entering a house where people had become ill, as many police officers do today when making arrests in the lower depths, since AIDS in the United States has become increasingly a disease of the urban poor, particularly blacks and Hispanics. It's always been that way. Like, it's weird that she's saying that as if that's the first thing, like as if every form of disenfranchisement doesn't compound and always affect the most, like, just horrifically treated people in any one society. Like, that's been the case quite literally forever, as far as I've ever seen. Many barbers and dentists wore masks and gloves, as dentists and dental hygienists do now. As if not now, though. This is, again, late 80s. But the great influenza epidemic, which killed 20 million people, was an affair of 15 months. With a slow motion epidemic, these same precautions take on a life of their own. They become part of social mores, not a practice adopted for a brief period of emergency, then discarded. With an epidemic in which there is no immediate prospect of a vaccine, much less of a cure, prevention plays a larger part in consciousness. But campaigns to keep people from getting ill run into many difficulties with diseases that are venereally transmitted. There has always been reluctance in American health campaigns to communicate information about ways of having safer sex. So the reason why was snickering before when we were talking about the idea of even before they mentioned dentists was because it reminded me of like the PSAs from different like sexual organizations that were suggesting that folks like go to glory holes instead of like anything else, like any other like public sex club, as if that was going to be like somewhat safer with what we knew of COVID. And who knows, maybe in some sentences it is, but with what we know now, it didn't sound like it would actually be any safer. But that was something I documented in my diss as well. The U.S. Guide for Schools, issued in late 1987 by the Department of Education, virtually refuses to discuss reducing risk and proposes abstinence as the best way of safeguarding against AIDS, recalling lectures given soldiers during World War I that chastity was the only safeguard against syphilis, as well as part of their patriotic duty in fighting the Hun. to just to defeat the Hun. God damn it. Fucking Disney. I know, it's so true. Yeah, I mean, and that's really like what so much of the history really is just like, I mean, sometimes forgetfulness is its own useful purpose, but like with stuff like this, it's actually really harmful. I mean, it's just as harmful as people not being sexually educated properly to begin with, because the main reason why people believe these things, and I said this even during my SB 83 hearing, like, the vast majority of people in the United States are sexually miseducated. And that's because of this kind of decade. I mean, because obviously the return to Puritanism in like the late 80s and 90s, it was very deliberately. Like the only reason why most of us aren't properly sexually educated is because the funding was deliberately not put into it. And it increases all forms of violence and all forms of self-ignorance. It's a true problem. Like, and it relates to everything going on in the COVID era as well, which is why it always needs to be mentioned, because it's just a technology. The lack of education is its own technology. And it creates a violent society. Among many other things, of course. Talk of condoms and clean needles is felt to be tantamount to condoning and abetting illicit sex, illegal chemicals. Yeah, exactly. I know, yeah. I think I had, well, because, like, I already, like, that's the one thing I was lucky with, because my mom was, like, very open with, like, actually, like, so I was, like, properly educated. I got, like, books at home and stuff. But I didn't get, like, a sex ed class. I did maybe in, like, fifth grade or something, like, some basics, like, around menstruation and stuff. But beyond that, like, for me, I think, like, in high school, I had, like, a health teacher. I don't think I had the gym teacher. Well, actually, now that I think about it, though, the gym teacher was the health teacher. So it was. Yeah, that's a good point. And I didn't take any AP stuff, so I never knew if maybe they had a second one, but I just wasn't a part of. They were like, you got to be this standardized in the form of education to get sex ed part 3. And to some extent it is. Education about how to keep from getting AIDS does imply an acknowledgement of, therefore tolerance of, the ineradicable variousness of expression of sexual feeling. European societies less committed to sexual hypocrisy at the level of public edict are unlikely to urge people to be chaste as a way of warning them to be prudent. Be careful, AIDS. And AIDS, don't die of ignorance. Is that really what they would say? Like, those were the slogans? The specific meaning of these generalities, to be seen on billboards and television spots throughout Western Europe for several years, is use condoms. But there is a larger meaning in all these messages about being careful, not being ignorant, that will facilitate the acceptance of this kind of public service, add here as well. Part of making an event real is just saying it over and over. Yeah. In this case, to say it over and over is to instill the consciousness of risk, the necessity of prudence as such, prior to and superseding any specific recommendation. I think that makes it hard for me to, like, fully understand, like, that element of, like, sexual shame, because, like, I was born in 1990, so, like, quite literally right after she would have written this part of the book. And, like, as much as I can, like, in some capacity, understand the level of social change that a shift in a society returning to, like, I mean, just that amount of ignorance, like, just like fueled lack of education broadly. I really can't get it at the same time. Like, it didn't really occur to me how new the idea of wearing condoms really was when I was just a kiddo. You know what I mean? How could I? I mean, we're born into the world that's here. Like, but yeah, I don't know. Can't really wrap my head around it. It's probably much like kids that are born after the internet. Like, they're just sort of like, yeah, I don't know. It's just always been here. Of course, between the perennial official hypocrisy and the fashionable libertinism of recent decades, there is a vast gap. The view that sexually transmitted diseases are not serious reached its apogee in the 1970s, which was almost when many male homosexuals reconstituted themselves as something like an ethnic group, one whose distinctive folkloric custom was sexual veracity, and the institutions of urban homosexual life became a sexual delivery system of unprecedented speed, efficiency, and volume. Fear of AIDS enforces a much more moderate exercise of appetite, and not just among homosexual men. In the United States, sexual behavior pre 1981 now seems for the middle age wait for the middle the middle age for the middle class part of a lost age of innocence in the guise of lasciviousness, of course. After 2 decades of sexual spending, of sexual speculation, of sexual inflation, we're in the early stages of a sexual depression. Yeah, she anticipated it. I know, truly. I know, I really, and I remember talking about, like, I mean, in a, like, a very distanced, like, not informed sense. Like, you hear about, like, the 60s, and it truly just feels like an entirely different planet. Like, it's wild. Looking back on the sexual culture of the 1970s has been compared to looking back on the jazz age from the wrong side of the 1929 crash. Wow. What a sentence to continue, and that is so relevant to what you just said. One set of messages of the society we live in is consume, grow, do what you want, amuse yourselves. The very working of this economic system, which has bestowed these unprecedented liberties, most cherished in the form of physical mobility and material prosperity, depends on encouraging people to defy limits. Appetite is supposed to be immoderate. The ideology of capitalism makes us all into connoisseurs of liberty, of the indefinite expansion of possibility. Virtually every kind of advocacy claims to offer, first of all, or also, some increment of freedom. Not every freedom, to be sure. In the rich countries, freedom has come to be identified more and more with personal fulfillment, a freedom enjoyed or practiced alone or as alone. Hence much of recent discourse about the body, reimagined as the instrument with which to enact, increasingly, various programs of self-empowerment, or self-improvement, self-improvement, really, of the heightening of powers. Right, yeah. Given the imperatives about consumption and the virtually unquestioned value attached to the expression of self, how could sexuality not have come to be, for some, a consumer operation? Or no, well, that too, but she said option for real. An exercise of liberty, of increased mobility, of the pushing back of limits. But no, truly, I mean, and like Arcosovi, I like it. I can't, I don't know if that's right, but hopefully it is. But the way that that was only a short ways away from corporations becoming like their own beings that were allowed to, like, have rights also. Like, that's definitely anticipatory of that. Hardly an invention of the male homosexual subculture, recreational risk-free sexuality is an inevitable reinvention of the culture of capitalism and was guaranteed by medicine as well. This is why so much of my dissertation is even written, because that's exactly what's happened. The advent of AIDS seems to have changed all that irrevocably. Irrevocably. AIDS magnifies the force of the quite different yet complementary messages increasingly heard by people in the society accustomed to being able to provide pleasures for themselves, more and more of whom are drawn to programs of self-management and self-discipline, diet, exercise. Watch your appetites. Take care of yourself. Don't let yourself go. Limits have long been set on the indulgence of certain appetites in the name of health or of the creation of an ideal physical appearance, voluntary limits, and exercise of freedom. That's exactly like, and again, that's intricately tied in to the rhetorics that I found about like biomimetic sex tech, which is like, it's innovation, but it's also novelty. And like, a late stage neoliberal hyper individualization and like mechanization of sexuality that is very much alive today. Yeah. Oh, okay, for sure. Yeah. So it really, so she, and it's interesting because I don't know if she's mentioning that explicitly or if it's just understood between the lines. The catastrophe of AIDS suggests the immediate necessity of limitation and constraints for the body and for consciousness. But the response to AIDS is more than reactive, more than a fearful and therefore appropriate response to a very real danger. It also expresses a positive desire, the desire for stricter limits in the conduct of personal life. There is a broad tendency in our culture, an end of an era of feeling that AIDS is reinforcing, an exhaustion for many of purely secular ideals, ideals that seem to encourage libertinism. Oh, I don't know why I'm second guessing the way that, because it's not an E, so it is, or at least not provide any coherent inhibition against it, in which the response to AIDS finds its place. The behavior AIDS is stimulating is part of a larger, grateful return to what is perceived as conventions, like the return to figure and landscape, tonality and melody, plot and character, and other much vaunted reputations. Rep, rep, reputations, I think that's right, of difficult modernism in the arts. The reduction in the imperative of promiscuity in the middle class, a growth of the ideal of monogamy, of a prudent sexual life, is as marked in, say, Stockholm, with its tiny number of AIDS cases, as it is in New York, where the disease can accurately be called of epidemic proportions. The response to AIDS, while in part perfectly rational, amplifies a widespread questioning that had been rising in intensity throughout the 1970s of many of the ideals and risks of enlightened modernity. And the new sexual realism goes with the rediscovery of the joys of tonal music. Bogaro, 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 a career in investment banking and church weddings. The mounting panic about the risks of recreational and commercialized sexuality is unlikely to diminish the attractions of other kinds of appetites. Boutiques are expected to fill the building in Hamburg until recently occupied by the Eros Center. Sexual exchanges are to be carried out only after forethought. Routine consumption of drugs that boosted energies for mental work and for palaver. What? I don't know what that is. What also rose throughout the 1970s was bourgeoisie cocaine use, has played its part in preparing for the neo-celibacy and waning of sexual spontaneity common among the educated in this decade. Machines supply new popular ways of inspiring desire and keeping it safe. That's exactly what the rhetoric in Midas says, yeah. As mental as possible, the commercially organized lechery by telephone, and in France by Minitel, that offers a version of anonymous promiscuous sex without the exchange of fluids. And strictures about contact now have their place in the computer world as well. The computer world. The World Wide Web. Everyone boot up your AOL hard disks or whatever. You're fucking put it in your CD-ROM. Computer users are advised to regard each new piece of software as a potential carrier of a virus. Never put a disk in your computer without verifying its source. The so-called vaccine programs being marketed are said to offer some protection, but the only sure way to curb the threat of computer viruses, experts agree, is to not share programs and data. The culture of consumption may actually be stimulated by the warnings to consumers of all kinds of goods and services to be more cautious, more selfish. For these anxieties will require the further replication of goods and services. Oh, yeah, maybe. No, for sure. I mean, that's for sure. Like, I mean, there was, so the company that I looked at, like, at least primarily in my disc, was Laura DiCarlo. So they do biomimetic sex tech specifically for folks with vulvas. And like their main thing was when, because I started looking at their, I forget what the actual dates were when I looked at their ads, but I looked at their email ads and the language in it, like, because I looked at like rhetoric, and that was like my primary method in my disc, but then the secondary analysis was like I contextualized them in the discourses on TikTok, which is why I ended up finding the late in life realized neuroqueer discourses and contextualizing the ads in them. Because on one hand, we had the ads that were like, "Hey, are you alone? Cause COVID hit." Like, well, guess what, bestie? We got a sex tech for you, and it's your vulva is a car, so we can rev your engine. Like that's basically the shit that they're saying. Like rhetorically, you got to look at chapter 5 of what I found because it's like so funny. Like everything that I made a joke about in that fake sponsor video the other day was basically in their actual advertisements. Like that, it was the language in it. Like it's actually just surprising that they didn't actually use no cap. But if it was a little bit later, I guarantee you that no cap is probably in some of their like later ads because that's just how ridiculous it was. I think we're gonna read one more section because there's like 20-ish minutes for like regularly scheduled reading day. No, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and that's why I was glad that even like Sontag said that like the culture of consumption may actually be stimulated by the warnings to consumers of all kinds of goods and services to be more cautious, more selfish. For these anxieties will require the further applications of goods and services. Like, that's exactly right. Like that's all they're really doing. I mean, and that's why like another thing that I'll just say before we start the section 8 is like in the same way that obviously like the early selling of sex tech was very much marketed as a novelty or sold as like a home good, like because there's a reason why like the Hitachi magic wands in particular are still like marketed as if they're just like a massage gun, like instead of like anything that is more like risque or like obscene. Like it's like because they had to like truly to be a good in the market they had to frame it that way, at least or in early years. I mean, that was just like sex stuff across the board had to be sold that way because of just the prudence of the society. Like, okay, section 8. Epidemics of particularly dreaded illnesses always provoke an outcry against leniency or tolerance, now identified as laxity, weakness, disorder, corruption, unhealthiness. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pinups too. I mean, anything. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why in the like pre-COVID, because I divided like the sex tech chapter, which is chapter 4 of my disc, into like pre-COVID sex tech, and that I included ads and also just like I forget if I had magazines. I might have made mention. But yeah, like anything. I mean, because pornography, as I gotta say, because of TikTok, counts as a sex tech, if you ask me. I mean, so does like any other form of media, truly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, so I mean, and the ads were just full of innuendo. Like it was unbelievable. The amount of puns was just it was out of control. Like even for me as someone who loves puns, I was like, come on. Like, yeah, this is a bit much. Demands are made to subject people to tests, to isolate the ill and those suspected of being ill or of transmitting illness, and to erect barriers against the real or imaginary contamination of foreigners. Societies already administered as garrisons, like China with a tiny number of detected cases, and Cuba with a significant number of the already ill, are responding more rapidly and preemptorily. AIDS is everyone's Trojan horse. 6 months before the 1988 Olympics, the South Korean government announced that it would be distributing free condoms to all foreign participants. This is a totally foreign disease, and the only way to stop its spread, is to stop sexual contacts between Indians and foreigners, declared the Director General of the Indian Government's Council for Medicinal Research, thereby avowing the total defenselessness of a population nearing a billion, for which there are presently no trained hospital staff members or treatment centers anywhere specializing in the disease. I thought that someone in the US was saying that, and I was like, oh, how racist is this about to get? And then it was still like, but it's substantially better than I thought it was going to say in the beginning of the sentence. His proposal for a sexual ban to be enforced by fines and prison terms is no less impractical as a means of curbing sexually transmitted diseases than the more commonly made proposals for quarantine, that is, for detention. Like how she has to define that. Like as that's another thing that's like been marred into our social consciousness is just knowing what a quarantine is. But this book had to be defined. The incarceration in detention camps surrounded by barbed wire during World War I was of some 30,000 American women, prostitutes, and women suspected of being prostitutes for the avowed purpose of controlling syphilis among army recruits, caused no drop in the military's rate of infection, just as incarceration during World War II of tens of thousands of Americans of Japanese ancestry as potential traitors and spies probably did not foil a single act of espionage or sabotage. That does not mean that comparable proposals for AIDS will not be made or will not find support and not only be the predictable people. Wait, and not only by the predictable people. If the medical establishment has been on the whole of a bulwark of sanity and rationality so far, refusing even to envisage, I swear, she just loves that word. I'm so aware of whenever she says it now. Programs of quarantine and detention, it may be in part because the dimensions of the crisis still seem limited and the evolution of the disease unclear. Uncertainty about how much the disease will spread, how soon and to whom, remains at the center of public discourse about AIDS. Will it, as it spreads around the world, remain restricted largely to marginal populations, to the so-called risk groups, and then to large sections of the urban poor, or will it eventually become the classic pandemic affecting entire regions? Oh yeah, very, very true. I know she's discussed at length. I don't remember what point you got in here, but definitely check out, like, especially I read the last couple weeks, we read all of just like the last two Thursdays. Uh Illness as metaphor, and she discusses that at length. And like I said earlier, I think you might have been here for this. Me reading also The Lonely Century, where it talks like at greater length. It's like a really perfect pairing in a way that I hadn't anticipated, talking about the way that like fear and isolation is used by authoritarian regimes. And I think that really speaks to like the rhetoric that she's getting to here with foreignness and like an idea of just disease being something that's influenced by an other, capital O. Or will it eventually become oh yeah, okay. Both views are in fact being held simultaneously. Oh, okay, for sure. Oh, okay. Well, good. I'm glad you're back. A wave of statements and articles affirming that AIDS threatens everybody is followed by another wave of articles asserting that it is a disease of them, not us. But yeah, check out the reading from last Thursday then. If it's not on my Twitch still, because it might have expired, I exported all the readings onto my YouTube and I gotta make them public. That's a great question. Yeah, so technically, I mean, I'm teaching officially, like in the university I'm still employed on contract with, like in a couple weeks. But I mean, I suppose all my free content technically counts. I mean, Twitch definitely counts as well, though, to my adherents. Eventually, I want to teach things that are not just public speaking, especially now that post PhD, I feel like I should be granted the opportunity, and I've earned my stripes, so to speak. At the beginning of 1987, the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services predicted that the worldwide AIDS epidemic would eventually make the Black Death the greatest epidemic ever recorded, which wiped out between a third and a half of the population of Europe, seem pale by comparison. At the end of the year, he said, "This is not a massive, widely spreading epidemic among heterosexuals, as so many people fear. Even more striking than the cyclical character of public discourse about AIDS is the readiness of so many to envisage, I swear, she loves that so much, the most far-reaching of catastrophes. Reassurances are multiplying in the United States and Western Europe. The general population is safe." Does that sound familiar? Because it should. But the general population may be as much a code phrase for whites as it is for heterosexuals. Just like it's a code phrase in the COVID era for anything, I mean, anyone that's not usually a middle, not even, I mean, that's the most bizarre part because it's almost taken on a pseudo quality that isn't even true. It's just a wide scale complete inaccuracy. But we know that obviously, as said before, any disenfranchisement is just compounding and making you more vulnerable to COVID too. And folks are still under the in like uninformed impression that if you're like rich and usually white, then you're just safe. And it's like, no, like no one is safe, you fool. Like look at the numbers, look at the research. Okay. Everyone knows that blacks sick. We hate the wording. Are getting AIDS in disproportionate numbers. True, yeah. As there is a disproportionate number of blacks in the armed forces and a vastly disproportionate number in prisons. Yeah, I mean, definitely. Obviously, institutionalization always rises numbers of people making, I mean, having an inability to take, whether it's distancing or PPE, to the level of anyone that may or may not be able to afford it outside of a prison. But yeah, or any other form of institutionalization, because obviously there's plenty more than that. The AIDS virus is an equal opportunity destroyer, was the slogan of a recent fundraising campaign by the American Foundation for AIDS Research. Punning on equal opportunity employer, the phrase subliminally reaffirms what it means to deny that AIDS is an illness that is in part of the world afflicts minorities, racial, and sexual, and about the staggering prediction made recently by the World Health Organization that barring improbably rapid progress in the development of a vaccine, there will be 10 to 20 times more AIDS cases in the next 5 years than there were in the last five. It is assumed that most of these millions will be Africans. AIDS quickly became a global event, discussed not only in New York, Paris, Rio, Kinshasa. I don't know why. I don't know. My brain did not do that right at all. Not even remotely. But also in Helsinki, Buenos Aires, Beijing, and Singapore, one who is far from the leading cause of death in Africa, much less in the world. There are famous diseases as there are famous countries, and these are not necessarily the ones with the biggest populations. AIDS did not become so famous just because it afflicts whites too, as some Africans bitterly assert. It's up to debate. Isn't it, Sontag? But it is certainly true that were AIDS only an African disease, however many millions were dying, few outside of Africa would be concerned with it. It would be one of those natural events, like famines, which periodically ravage poor, overpopulated countries, about which people in rich countries feel quite helpless. Because it is a world event, that is, because it affects the West, it is regarded as not just a natural disaster. It is filled with historical meaning. Part of the self-definition of Europe and the neo-European countries is that it, the first world, and again, we hate that, is where major calamities are history making, transformative, while in poor African or Asian countries, they are part of a cycle and therefore something like an aspect of nature. Nor has AIDS become so publicized because, as some have suggested, in rich countries, the illness first afflicted a group of people who were all men, almost all white, many of them educated, articulate, and knowledgeable about how to lobby and organize for public attention and resources devoted to the disease. Exactly, yes. Yeah, that's so, so true. AIDS occupies such a large part in our awareness because of what it has been taken to represent. It seems the very model of all the catastrophes privileged populations feel await them. I know, I forgot to say, I hate whenever people talk about things like hunger or anything else as if it's like something that couldn't have been dealt with. Like, even at this point in time, there's just, that shit's always just an excuse. Like, it's just, I don't know. What biologists and public health officials predict is something far worse than can be imagined or than society and the economy can tolerate. No responsible official holds out the slightest hope that the African economies and health services can cope with the spread of the disease predicted for the near future, while every day one can read the direst estimates of the cost of AIDS to the country that has reported the largest number of cases, the United States. Astonishingly, large sums of money are cited as the cost of providing minimum care to people who will be ill in the next few years. This is assuming that the reassurances to the general population are justified, an assumption much disputed within the medical community. Talk in the United States, and not only in the United States, is of a national emergency, possibly our nation's survival. An editorialist at the New York Times intoned last year, "We all know the truth, every one of us. We live in a time of plague, has never been visited on our nation. We can pretend it does not exist, or exists for those others, and carry on as if we do not know. And one French poster shows a giant UFO-like black mass hovering over and darkening with spidery rays most of the familiar hexagon shape of the country lying below. Above the image is written, "It depends on each of us to erase that shadow. Il dépend de chacun de nous d'effacer cette ombre." And underneath, France doesn't want to die of AIDS. La France ne veut pas mourir de sida. Sida. Such token appeals for mass mobilization to confront an unprecedented menace appear at frequent intervals in every mass society. It is also typical of a modern society the demand for mobilization be kept very general, and the reality of the response fall well short of what seems to be demanded to meet the challenge of the nation-endangering menace. This sort of rhetoric has a life of its own. It serves some purpose if it simply keeps in circulation an ideal of unifying communal practice that is precisely contradicted by the pursuit of accumulation and isolating entertainments enjoined on the citizens of a modern mass society. The survival of the nation, of civilized society, of the world itself, is said to be at stake, claims that are a familiar part of building a case for repression. An emergency requires drastic measures, etc. The end of the world rhetoric that AIDS has evoked does inevitably build such a case, but it also does something else. It offers a stoic, finally numbing contemplation of catastrophe. The eminent Harvard historian of science, Stephen Gould, we like that guy, I think, if I remember right, has declared, why do I, there's something, I think I know of him just because of media ecology, actually. I might have, I gotta look more into him because I forget. I can't remember if I know him because of Twitter or because of media, MEA. Has declared that the AIDS pandemic may rank with nuclear weaponry as the greatest danger of our era. Yeah, it sounds so familiar. It's gonna pick at me. But even if it kills as much as a quarter of the human race, a prospect Gould considers possible, there will still be plenty of us left, and we can start again. I don't know about that now. Scornful of the I don't know if I've ever seen this before either. Of the moralists, a rational and humane scientist proposes the minimum consolation. An apocalypse that doesn't have any meaning. AIDS is a natural phenomenon, not even an event with a moral meaning. Gould points out, there is no message in its spread. Of course, it is monstrous to attribute meaning in the sense of moral judgment to the spread of an infectious disease, but perhaps it is only a little less monstrous to be invited to contemplate death on this horrendous scale with equanimity. Much of the well-intentioned public discourse in our time expresses a desire to be candid about one or another of the various dangers which might be leading to all-out catastrophe. And now there is one more. To the death of oceans and lakes and forests and the unchecked growth of populations in the poor parts of the world. What a horrible way to describe that. Again, underdeveloped is much more important. Deliberately underdeveloped. Nuclear accidents like Chernobyl, the puncturing and depletion of the ozone layer, the perennial threat of nuclear confrontation between the superpowers, or nuclear attack by one of the rogue states not under superpower control. To all these now adds AIDS. And also I hate the language of superpower control. That shit's bullshit. Oh, really? Oh, then maybe actually I know him because bad stuff. Because I feel like I usually know evolutionary biologists not for good reasons. So maybe my memory is just off. In the countdown to a millennium, a rise in apocalyptic thinking may be inevitable. Still, God, that sounds just so, even from that, it would be so nice to be on the other 20 years of the millennium rather than this one right now. Still, the amplitude of the fantasies of doom that AIDS has inspired can't be explained by the calendar alone, or even by the very real danger the illness represents. There is also the need for an apocalyptic scenario that is specific to Western society, and perhaps even more so to the United States. America, as someone has said, is a nation with the soul of a church, an evangelical church prone to announcing radical endings and brand new beginnings. The taste for worst-case scenarios reflects the need to master fear of what is felt to be uncontrollable. It also expresses an imaginative complicity with disaster. The sense of cultural distress or failure gives rise to the desire for a clean sweep, a tabula rasa. No one wants a plague, of course, but yes, it would be a chance to begin again. And beginning again, that is very modern, very American, too. Ugh, God, it just reads so awful, especially now. Like, truly in this exact month, for instance. AIDS may be extending the propensity for becoming inured to vistas of global annihilation, which the stocking and brandishing of nuclear arms has already promoted. Oh, yeah, okay. I know, I gotta look into why I know who dude is, because I feel like, hmm, yeah, ugh. But thank you for looking into that, by the way. Maybe I must know him for horrible things then, yeah. With the inflation of apocalyptic rhetoric has come the increasing unreality of the apocalypse. Again, 7 years ago, a permanent modern scenario, apocalypse looms, and it doesn't occur, and it still looms. We seem to be in the throes of one of the modern kinds of apocalypse. There is the one that's not happening, whose outcome remains in suspense. The missile is circling the Earth above our heads with a nuclear payload that could destroy all life many times over, that haven't, so far, gone off. Like, it's easy to not even remember that at this point with everything else happening. Like, yeah, wow, it's just wild. It gives me a better context though to understand like why people are kind of just like probably burnt out on the shit that I say. So maybe I should have a bit more grace. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's so real. And there are, oh wait, yeah, and there are ones that are happening and yet seem not to have, oh, yeah, to not, okay, I wasn't sure if I already read this. That's where my hesitancy is coming from. And there are ones that are happening and yet seem not to have, so far, the most feared consequences, like the astronomical third world debt, like overpopulation, like ecological blight, or that happened and then we are told didn't happen, like the October 1987 stock market collapse, which was a crash like the one in October 1929, and was not. So obviously, again, fuck most of that language, and here we are seeing the consequences of exactly what yeah, the slow decline of the empire. Ominously, yeah, exactly, yeah, so true, yeah. I know, and I'm glad to see more and more people talking about that specifically, referring to the fact, I mean, and whether it's the collapse of, a imperialism or any kind of late stage capitalist structure built on colonialism, or just like the way that social change doesn't work like that either. Like, and the way that it's cast that way to just control and reinforce the current structure. Apocalypse is now a long running serial. Not Apocalypse Now, but Apocalypse from now on. Oh my god. Apocalypse has become an event that is happening and not happening. It may be that some of the most feared events, like those involving the irreparable ruin of the environment, have already happened. But we don't know it yet because the standards have changed, or because we do not have the right indices for measuring the catastrophe, or simply because this is a catastrophe in slow motion, or feels as if it is in slow motion because we know about it, can't anticipate it, and now have to wait for it to happen to catch up with what we think we know. Modern life accustoms us to live with the intermittent awareness of monstrous, unthinkable, but we are told quite probable disasters. Every major event is haunted, not only by its representation as an image, an old doubling of reality now, which began in 1839 with the invention of the camera. Besides the photographic or electronic simulation of events, there is also the calculation of their eventual outcome. Reality has bifurcated into the real thing and an alternative version of it twice over. There is the event and its image, and there is the event and its projection. But as real events often seem to have no more reality for people than images, and to need the confirmation of their images, so our reaction to events in the present seeks confirmation in a mental outline with appropriate computations of the event in its projected ultimate form. Yeah, exactly. I know that's what I'm thinking of. And then, like, especially now, like, understanding COVID more in this context of, like, I don't know, like this kind of this is why I'm reading this. It's just like I think that it's gonna both help me as someone who's like parsing out these ideas in the book in coming weeks and like just understanding more of the denialism and stuff. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and also like again, it contextualizes further as well, like the understandings of like another video I just saw earlier today where it's like somebody who's obviously like somewhat TikTok famous already, like at least a couple 100,000 followers, and they were like, "Yeah, my daughter was called like, and I hate using crazy as like a negative word, but she was using it as like a quote. It was like, oh, my daughter was called crazy for, doing environmental activism and getting arrested a bunch of times. But now, obviously, we wake up and there's smog all over the East Coast when it usually isn't like that. Like how, because obviously it is like that on the West Coast from fires. And now it's like, yeah, whether it's a tsunami or like anything else, like there's just, like she was just like, yeah, and that's just how it's gonna be now from what they say. Like, and she, like, but she said she called her friend who's like a researcher, an environmental researcher, like Cornell, I think maybe, and was like, oh yeah, it started. Like, eventually breathing the air that isn't full of just horror is going to be something that only the privileged can have. And anyone else, especially those working outside, it's going to be like the equivalent of working in a coal mine. And that's just going to be the normal thing because only the rich are going to be able to install like stuff that can clean the air inside their homes. And it's like, we're already seeing it. And that's exactly what this is reminding me of more. Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's still going on from what I understand. Future mindedness is as much the distinctive mental habit and intellectual corruption of this century as the history mindedness that, as Nietzsche pointed out, transformed thinking in the 19th century. Being able to estimate how matters will evolve into the future is an inevitable byproduct of a more sophisticated, quantifiable, testifiable understanding of process, social as well as scientific. Well, and that's an interesting idea, but I think obviously what's more even important and what I talk about more, like in regards to the misunderstanding of that claim, is like what she just spoke to. And maybe she's going to expand on this and I'm getting ahead of myself. But the idea of like a claim to understanding the future, I mean, that's really what I'm saying with the term that I also put in my disc, which is uncashable future technological promises. Like anything that technology claims they can do, but it's usually just like a bold, well advertised venture capitalist promise that can't actually be provided. That's what I feel like a lot of these methods are really doing, especially knowing that like 75% of test subjects are like white college age people that don't exactly, yeah, that don't, oh, I thought you said, yeah, it's another larger pattern, white society. I read that, like, yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. But yeah, like even like the claim for quantitative anything to like represent everything. I mean, again, the God trick, etc., etc. The ability to project events with some accuracy into the future enlarged what power consisted of because it was a vast new source of instructions about how to deal with the present. Same with big data. Like big data. I mean, and people, again, that's what's so scary about fucking Blackstone, who's owned by BlackRock and Vanguard, now owning Ancestry.com data. Because it's like those motherfuckers think that they're seeing the full picture. And in an increasingly fascist and eugenic society, who knows what they're going to claim to do with it? Even though we know that that data has no meaning by itself, they're gonna think that it's the complete picture because they're just as fed on the like lies of a quantified belief in what is like what has happened. It's merging what she's saying here about the claim to the future with obviously the claims of the past and what's happening now. And it's always all those things if we're talking about the future anyway, but like it's important to make that explicit. But in fact, the look into the future, which was once tied to a vision of linear progress, has, with more knowledge at our disposal than anyone could have dreamed, turned into a vision of disaster. Every process is a prospect and invites a prediction bolstered by statistics. Say the number now, in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, and of course at the end of the century. Anything in history or nature that can be described as changing steadily can be seen as heading towards catastrophe. Either the too little and becoming less, waning, decline, and entropy, or the too much, ever more than we can handle or absorb, uncontrollable growth. Most of what experts pronounce about the future contributes to this new double sense of reality, beyond the doubleness to which we are already accustomed by the comprehensive duplication of everything in images. There is what is happening now, and there is what it portends, the imminent but not yet actual and not really graspable disaster. Oh, nice. That sounds awesome. Let me get in on that. Okay. But no, I'm thinking too about like remix culture and like the way that obviously like the algorithmic age and platforms like have influenced journalism and the way that like that is changing in a different but related way to what she says here about images. Two kinds of disaster, actually, and a gap between them in which the imagination flounders. The difference between the epidemic we have and the pandemic that we are promised by current statistical extrapolations feels like the difference between the wars we have, so-called limited wars, and the unimaginably more terrible ones we could have, the latter, with all the appurtenances of science fiction, being the sort of activity people are addicted to staging for fun as electronic games. I mean, that's basically just the war on what the fuck do they even call it? The weapons of mass destruction. That's basically what happened. The idea took on. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and how it's exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's why like philosophy of science and philosophy of history is just everything. And same with, of course, philosophy of medicine. For beyond the real epidemic, with its inexorably mounting death toll, statistics are used or issued by national and international health organizations every week, every month, is a qualitatively different, much greater disaster which we think both will and will not take place. Same with obviously their lack of testing with COVID now. The for-profit process of testing since they ended the emergency order, the lack now of even testing wastewater in many places. And they're equating not only in this era were they equating the belief in what is happening now and in the future with the belief in quantifying things. Now they're deliberately censoring the quantification as if the lapse in their testing is equivalent to a lack of COVID existing. That is like the most like overt way in which we've come to rely on a lie and myth of the use of quantification to determine reality. that's what I was gonna like. I've made some stuff, and I know plenty of COVID conscious folks have talked about that on this app in particular, like on TikTok specifically. But like, yeah, truly, I mean, she's detailing that perfectly. Where was I here? Oh, yes, okay. Like the demographic predictions, which are probably just as accurate, the big news is usually bad. A proliferation of reports or projections of unreal, that is, ungraspable doomsday eventualities, tends to produce a variety of reality denying responses. Thus, in most discussions of nuclear warfare being rational, the self description of experts means not acknowledging the human reality while taking in emotionally even a small part of what is at stake for human beings. The province of those who regard themselves as the menaced means insisting on unrealistic demands for the rapid dismantling of the peril. This split of public attitude into the inhuman and the all too human is much less stark with AIDS. Experts denounce the stereotypes attached to people with AIDS and to the continent where it is presumed to have originated, emphasizing that the disease belongs to much wider populations than the groups initially at risk and to the whole world, not just to Africa. For while AIDS has turned out, not surprisingly, to be one of the most meaning-laden of diseases, along with leprosy and syphilis, clearly there are checks on the impulse to stigmatize people with the disease. The way in which the illness is such a perfect repository for people's most general fears about the future, to some extent, renders irrelevant the predictable efforts to pin the disease on a deviant group or a dark continent. Like the effects of industrial pollution and the new system of global financial markets, the AIDS crisis is evidence of a world in which nothing important is regional, local, limited, in which everything that can circulate does, and every problem is or is destined to become worldwide. That's a super timely observation for especially like the early 80s. Yeah, no, for sure, exactly, yeah. Because that was, I mean, that's the heyday of globalization. Goods circulate, including images and sounds and documents, which circulate fastest of all electronically. Garbage circulates. The poisonous industrial wastes of Saint Etienne, Hanover, Mistra, and Bristol are being dumped in the coastal towns of West Africa. People circulate in greater numbers than ever, and diseases, from the untrammeled intercontinental air travel for pleasure and business of the privileged, to the unprecedented migrations of the underprivileged, from villages to cities and legally and illegally from country to country, All this physical mobility and interconnectedness, with its consequent dissolving of old taboos, social and sexual, is as vital to the maximum functioning of the advanced or world capitalist economy as is the easy transmissibility of goods and images and financial instruments. But now that heightened modern interconnectedness in space, which is not only personal but social structural, is the bearer of a health menace, sometimes described as a threat to the species itself, and the fear of AIDS is of a piece with attention to other unfolding disasters that are the byproduct of advanced society, particularly those illustrating the degradation of the environment on a world scale. AIDS is one of the dystopian harbingers of the global village, that future which is already here and always before us, which no one knows how to refuse. I'm laughing because obviously that's like a big, like, I think McLuhan obviously is famous for that, and I'm sure that's really what Sontag is speaking to, but who knows? For all I know, he took that from someone else. As was often the case in my experience, just in the short time of seeing. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I was thinking about this just the other night in like an especially depressive rumination. But like the idea of any form of violence that was already pre-existing is now being further inflamed by the possibility of contracting COVID, especially in an era of COVID denialism, where they'll say, well, like, so if let's say you experience insert any type of violence here because you're being trafficked, for instance, you're now perpetually not only experiencing that horrific experience, but you're being perpetually put at risk to become disabled and die of a virus that people are pretending now also doesn't exist because you're not already treated like a human, obviously. So that's like a persistent additional violence that people are being inflicted with, especially again, as we now know. And I really didn't even think about this, but I mentioned it earlier when I was playing Stardew Valley of all things, but the way that the child labor laws are being lowered, we just know that a 16-year-old being paid to work inside of a bar now in like the state of Iowa sure isn't going to be influencing anyone to be wearing a mask to protect their life at work as a child in a bar full of adults. They're definitely not going to be doing that. Like, and how could they? Like, and they're not going to be treated as a protected class for their age, despite the fact that they are. It's just so, it's absurd. It's all absurd. That even an apocalypse can be made to seem part of the ordinary horizon of expectation constitutes an unparalleled violence that is being done to our sense of reality, to our humanity. What a perfect sentence to follow up that thought. But it is highly desirable for a specific dreaded illness to come to seem ordinary. Even the disease most fraught with meaning can become just an illness. Right. Yeah, it's true. It has happened with leprosy, though some 10 million people in the world, easy to ignore since almost all live in Africa, and the Indian subcontinent have what is now called, as part of its wholesome de-dramatization, Hansen's disease, after the Norwegian physician who over a century ago discovered the bacillus. It is bound to happen with AIDS when the illness is much better understood and above all treatable. For the time being, much in the way of individual experience and social policy depends on the struggle for rhetorical ownership of the illness, how it is possessed, assimilated in argument and in cliché. The age-old, seemingly inexorable process whereby diseases acquire meanings, by coming to stand for the deepest fears and inflict stigma, is always worth challenging, and it does seem to have more limited credibility in the modern world among people willing to be modern. The process is under surveillance now. With this illness, one that elicits so much guilt and shame, the effort to detach it from these meanings, these metaphors, seems particularly liberating, even consoling. But the metaphors cannot be distanced just by abstaining from them. They have to be exposed, criticized, belabored, used up. Not all metaphors applied to illnesses and their treatment are equally unsavory and distorting. It's just fascinating because to think about the way that COVID's been responded to, the disease itself it hasn't been stigmatized at all. In fact, it's almost been the opposite. It's almost been treated as like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just the flu, right? That's how it's been framed. The masks are what's being stigmatized, which is like, what? Like, that's fucking fascinating. In the most horrific way, obviously, I mean that. But fascinating in like how, after reading this, how is that happening? And then what, to whose benefit and to whose consequence, obviously. Um, Not all metaphors applied to illnesses and their treatment are equally unsavory and distorting. Yeah, the one I am most eager to see retired more than ever since the emergence of AIDS is the military metaphor. Twinkle is like, it's past 8:30. It is almost 9:30. I demand treats. Twinkle, we only have a couple pages left, I swear. The one I am most eager to see retired more than ever since the emergence of AIDS is the military metaphor. Its converse, the medical model of the public WEAL, is probably more dangerous and far reaching in its consequences, since it not only provides a persuasive justification for authoritarian rule, but implicitly suggests the necessity of state-sponsored repression and violence, the equivalent of surgical removal or chemical control of the offending or unhealthy parts of the body politic. So yeah, it's just population control, I guess, like in a sense of quite literally I mean, it's just eugenics. Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, it's the worst. But the effect of the military imagery, or yeah, imagery on thinking about sickness and health is far from inconsequential. It over mobilizes, it over describes, and it powerfully contributes to the excommunicating and stigmatizing of the ill. And it's like, I wonder, there's only like a paragraph left, but I know I'm going to forget this thought if I don't say it now. Like, I can't help but think then, if we're almost in like and I say this like half jokingly, but it's almost like after this we're in like a post stigma of illness phase where people are like, yeah, we don't actually even care if anyone who's vulnerable dies, no matter how many like, and that's what makes me wonder, like, is there going to be a turning point? Like, I mean, I just saw another TikTok the other day, and it might be like duetted by other folks this morning, talking about like the math. If we continue allowing COVID to spread unabated, the amount of long COVID that is inevitably going to happen, even though of course there are going to be people that never get it. The good amount of us, they say, following this formula, it would take like 7 years if a person only gets COVID once every year for the next 7 years. They're saying that there would be odds are good a majority of people in the populace that have long COVID. If they only, or no, was it one, maybe three? I forget. But anyway, it's like it's a really short period of time before basically the mass of the populace becomes disabled in a way that they will only understand if they live through it, apparently, unless something gets done. I know, yeah, exactly, yeah. It's like, yeah, truly. That it's so conflicting. Yeah, that's such a good point. I'm really glad that you said that. Because I'm definitely in that state myself. And it's really, truly like, I'm finally like becoming who I really am. Like, even for the first time in my life. And the world is fucking falling apart. And it needs to fall apart, as many people have said. They're very, very true. It needs to, in most ways. But I want to survive, man. Like, I didn't live through all this shit to just die. Like, I didn't like, fuck. Like, that's exactly how I feel about it. No, it is not desirable for medicine any more than for war to be total. Neither is the crisis created by AIDS a total anything. We are not being invaded. The body is not a battlefield. The ill are neither unavoidable casualties nor the enemy. We medicine, society, are not authorized to fight back by any means whatever. About that metaphor, the military one, I would say, if I may paraphrase Lucretius, give it back to the war makers. That's a good phrase. Oh wait, we finished it. I thought that there was gonna be more. Okay, well good. That's a good place to stop then, I guess. Damn, there's a lot of end notes though, like a lot. It almost seems like a bad idea not to actually schedule one more reading of this book to finish these. Even though it won't make sense outside of it. But the context of it really seems like it's super important because there's just so many of them. Hmm. Well, good. We made quick work of that. I was surprised by how short Illness's metaphor was in itself. Like I didn't expect to finish that in just two readings. But the Thursday, the second Thursday, like the one that we actually finished the reading of Illness and Metaphor in and then started AIDS and its metaphors. I also the day before read all of the book Care Work. So definitely check that out. It's very important. Especially I mean, like everything else, especially now. But it's been super good to just like, especially because that was the day after or the day of the fires starting. I was like, I need optimism. Like that was like the first time in TikTok in a while where I created a TikTok that was like, hey, remember the good things we're doing? Hey, remember I promised not to like because I don't know. I think there's an importance as a society to just have the balance when people are being too optimistic, to have the pessimism and the reality. But then if I see the overwhelming depression and response to crisis, I then cling to like the opposite to try to achieve a balance. And I think it's weird to have that kind of mentality in a society like this, like in a late stage neoliberal capitalist society. Because for the most part, right, I feel like in my lifetime, I've assumed the position of basically being the pessimist or the realist in a society that is glossing over all of the ongoing and potential future terror. Like, and so people have come to understand the way that I work as if I'm just like all bad news bears all the time. But truly, I'm just trying to make sure that we're grasping the full picture of what's happening. And I feel like I'm trying to fill in the blanks as most oppositional or critical scholars do. And if people aren't going to like deal with the reality of what's happening, like someone fucking needs to. Like, because clearly the reason why we're in the mess that we are, besides the oligarchical rule, is because people have been unwilling or just comfortable enough to not fully capture what's happened and what's happening. Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you. Oh, for sure. Okay, yeah. I know, I think I heard about that not too long ago. I mean, it's amazing what so many like little shroomy funky guys can do. Like whether it's, you know, I mean, again, I mean, it's same with like whether it's the stuff that can eat plastic or like, I mean, we know that we can remove the PFAS from the water. Like we can remove forever chemicals. They have the name forever chemicals because if you don't do the thing we know that we can do to remove them, because it's not profitable to apparently make sure that the population isn't just constantly ingesting microplastics or constantly ingesting PFAS. Um, like we can do it. It's just they don't want to. And it's like, are you fucking serious? Like, what are we doing? Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I know. I hope so. I really think so. I mean, because I feel like, I mean, and that's something that like it occurred to me only like in its full scale during my master's and learning about social change and like studying like rhetoric of agitation control more. Like truly like the power of people like seeing people say things that they're not used to seeing or hearing. Like, and again, it's not a coincidence that obviously, even though Me Too has been completely co-opted and like it didn't trickle down, um, the way that I saw that emerge at the end of my master's has definitely also deeply influenced, on top of learning all the other social change theory that I did during that couple years. Like, it made me realize how much that, especially again, as someone that didn't know I was an autist, especially PDA profile, and was basically publicly shamed into almost silence for most of my life, just like laughing along with all of the discrimination as if that's okay. Um, Instead of speaking against it, I understand the importance of seeing or hearing one person say something about the hope of what we can do, because we very much can, and we need to. And that's why it's like, it sucks to see it. It sucks to see so many people fall into like, whether it's like two-party corporatist rhetorics or like anything that like speaks to as if we're not en masse able to make changes in a way that allows us to protect our species. Like we very much can. It's fully within our capacity. We've never been able to make change faster. But I understand that people, I mean, it's really easy. I still get consumed with the depression too. I still get consumed with the feeling of insurmountability of it all. But there's times for that, and then there's times for a reminder of what we have the capacity to change, and we have the capacity to change this. We have to. I mean, we don't have choice if we want to continue to survive as a species. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know, and that's what sucks. I wonder sometimes if like because I've studied a good amount, like I said, of like neoliberal diversity inclusion rhetoric, and it's like flattened state that is ultimately always going to funnel through the logics of capitalism and like reformism and stuff. Same with like the nonprofit industrial complex. And my concern lately, and I've had this like hunch more and more recently, but I'm concerned that like people are even co-opting, like, okay, for instance, this is a perfect example. There was somebody on like a website that looks for experts to talk about certain topics, that was a consulting agency curious about the eat the rich rhetoric. A consulting agency. Um, and I was like, is this really like is this the end stage of capitalism? Co-opting like literal, not even just like neoliberal rhetoric, but like attempting to co-opt full scale, like the idea of capitulation itself. I don't know what that would look like, but I wouldn't put it past that shit. Like, I wouldn't put it past this fucked up system. Yeah, I feel that if I'm fresh. I know. I mean, like, truly, I've never been, I mean, at least in my adult life, so possibly, like, financially unstable. And I have a whole PhD, as I've been talking about, and been saying as long as I've been on TikTok, at least. Like, it's ridiculous. It's not like I could go back to live with parents. Like, my dad's in poor health. Like he just got out of the hospital yesterday. He certainly can't afford to take me in as a 33-year-old millennial. Like, that also needs to stay here to have the job that is supposed to be paying me enough to live, but is not. I know education should for sure be free. Yeah, I know for sure. They're gonna try to privatize water to the best of their capacity, for sure. I mean, that's been a long time coming. Mad Max land. Oof. Thanks off. I'm gonna keep that. I'm gonna put that in my pocket for later. I for sure will. I mean, like I said, I think a leftist, COVID conscious like commune is looking better and better every day. Like, truly, and like learning skills about how to grow food, etc. I know I was joking earlier today that I was gonna like be a born again PhD student if that's what it takes for me to get an income. It's just I can't in good faith recommend to anyone getting a PhD unless you happen to be like in a market that somehow pays you enough to live and isn't just building into the structure in a way that is killing us all. I don't know if that exists. It must. It has to, right? The probability. Oh yeah, I don't know anything about North Carolina, I guess. I don't, like I said, I'm literally the worst at geography, so I'm ignorant when it comes down to anywhere besides where I've lived, which is I've lived basically nowhere. Except for a couple states in the Midwest. About three parts, to be specific. Yeah. It's corporate education is no good. That's why honestly I mean, in a perfect world, I would just be able to do streaming stuff and be able to do remote work. Like that's really I'm like right on the edge of the cliff to jump off to completely give up on academia. And I think that's most disabled scholars at this point. At least those of us that don't have like a tenure track job and can't do remote accommodations because the administrations refuse. Yeah. I mean, maybe. I mean, the media landscape is for sure fucked, no matter what. If it's not Russia, it's for sure the oligarchy because that owns it already. So, yeah. Yeah, corporate, I mean, education is corporate America these days. It has been for at least decades, for sure. I don't, That's a good question. I know I've been asking that myself. Nah, if you figure it out, I'll tell you. Or if you figure it out, you tell me, and if I figure it out, I'll tell you where we go from here. I know, I thought so too. But at least you kind of figuring that out. You said before pursuing the PhD. I don't know if that's better or worse. I've been trying to figure that out lately too. Like if it's better to have found that out in a real way after the PhD or if it is before. I guess these letters won't matter too much in the apocalypse. I don't know. It always depends on who you ask though, right? Thanks for the follow, a dub short. What a good name. We're only one follow away from the follow goal. Come over to the Twitch and give me a follow before I sign off. I gotta get off here. I can't decide if because I know I gotta at least give Twinkle treats. She's been very, very patient. She usually gets her treats like an hour ago. She's only pawed at me a couple times. But I'm gonna jump off here at least for this stream. Oh, okay. I know I only started Twitch, so this Twitch is new. I only started it like about a little under 2 weeks ago. At least in like a real like learn actually knowing how to stream way. So I'm super grateful for all the support, but I gotta get that goal, you know? But I'm gonna end this stream because it's called Sontag with a bunch of flowers as all of my titles are shown. Oh, nice. Okay, cool. Yeah, I kind of figured. I know I'm just kind of like a big old mishmash. Like TikTok puts me in like the neurodivergent niche, which is absolutely true. But I'm a critical scholar also. And I talk about like this new like field of study that I am helping pave with some colleagues in the field of media ecology. Thank you. I know, so you like so you I forget you can see well let me see, it's like down over here, the sadness that I put into the corner of the Twitch. At least this is not really a corner in this, but hell yeah. I know I've fully embraced that because I still haven't watched Inside Out, but I didn't understand at first since I hadn't watched it that folks were actually like it was like an endearing compliment. I thought it was like an insult at first, but I get it now and I fully embraced it. But like I said, I'm gonna I know everyone says that it's so good. I'm always skeptical of anything that like Disney and Pixar makes just because Disney, but because they're one of the big transnational and global media owners that the oligarchy has its hands in, as all of them. But at the same time, everyone says that this is good, so I gotta find a way to watch it. But like I said, I'm gonna close this stream and then I'm gonna probably start up a new one to play more Stardew Valley because I'm hyper fixated on it. It's amazing that I stopped actually to do the reading for real because I changed the stream because I basically stream 7 to 9 like every day, but Monday and Wednesday are like the like surprise like I which is the surprise yesterday was playing Stardew Valley all day even before the regularly scheduled stream, and then I played more earlier today. But I'm probably gonna play more now because I'm not too tired and I've been staying up late anyway. I gotta enjoy doing stuff at whatever time I want until the like class I gotta start teaching in like a couple weeks starts up anyway. So I gotta play all the Stardew Valley now. Yeah, fair enough. Disney has a lot of us. There's some I mean, that's not all bad, obviously. Never is. You die on any hill, it'll be Disney. My mentor and my masters could tell you some things. All things you probably wouldn't be very happy with hearing. All right, y'all. Thanks again for hanging out. Drink some water. Have a nice snack. I gotta eat. Actually, now that I think about it, before I play more Stardew Valley, I gotta eat dinner because I didn't do that before stream. So, because I played Stardew Valley from like 5:30 to like 7-ish, and then stopped at that stream and started up this one. So I gotta eat dinner. And then I'll come back and play Stardew Valley. But as always, thanks for hanging out. I will see you all soon. We all deserve better. I'm really enjoying it. I'm glad that we finished this book. It was, like I said, I was under the impression we would have at least one other Thursday of this reading, but I might in the next few days continue reading The Lonely Century, because like I said, I think it does a really good job of pairing with what Sontag began mentioning about like authoritarian regimes. So it like really well can be paired together. All right. I'll see you all soon. Thanks for hanging out. This is my little stream over thing for anyone on TikTok that hasn't seen it. But like I said, I'm gonna eat some dinner and then I'll probably be back to play more Stardew Valley.